The containment chamber's walls buckled with a sound like tearing metal, and the beast subject, Canine Omega, as the Karnathi called it, tripped through reinforced titanium as if it were paper. Red emergency lights bathed the research facility in blood-colored shadows, casting the creature's massive form in jagged silhouettes. It stood 3 meters tall, its body a grotesque fusion of sinew and chrome, biological muscle woven through mechanical enhancements that hummed with stolen energy. The scientists scattered like insects, their chitinous legs clicking against the steel floors in panicked retreat. But the beast didn't pursue them. It paused in the corridor, its head tilting as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it moved deeper into the facility with deliberate, almost cautious steps. Meanwhile, in the observation deck 3 levels above, a human student stood frozen at the viewport, watching her diplomatic cohort evacuate through the primary corridor. She'd stopped to retrieve her datapad, a stupid mistake that now left her alone as blast doors began sealing throughout the station. The distant roar of something massive echoed through the ventilation system, and her breath caught in her throat. The beast found her in a storage bay, where she'd taken a wrong turn trying to reach the emergency pods. She stumbled backward over scattered equipment crates, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sharp crack of pain. The creature filled the doorway, its breathing heavy and wet, condensation forming around its muzzle in the cold, recycled air. For a moment, neither moved. The human could see intelligence in those eyes, not the blank stare of a mindless weapon, but something calculating, something that weighed and measured. Then it stepped forward, and she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for death. Instead, she felt warm breath against her face, heard a deep snuffling as the beast inhaled her scent. When she dared to look, it was staring at her with what might have been confusion or recognition. Footsteps thundered in the corridor outside Karnathi security forces, their weapons charging with high-pitched whines. The beast's head snapped toward the sound, and then it did something inexplicable. It positioned itself between her and the doorway, its massive frame blocking any line of fire. The first pulse blast caught it in the shoulder, burning through synthetic flesh, and it roared, but it didn't move. It held its ground, shielding her. The escape happened in a blur of violence and smoke. The beast charged through the security team with brutal efficiency, not killing but incapacitating, and when it returned to where she cowered against the wall, it simply scooped her up in arms that could have crushed her spine. She screamed, but the creature ignored her terror and carried her through corridors, collapsing under emergency lockdown protocols. Through breaches it tore in hull plating, until they emerged onto the facility's exterior platform, where maintenance shuttles docked. Below them, the dead planet's surface stretched in grey desolation. The beast leaped an impossible distance and landed in a canyon system 100 meters down, absorbing the impact with hydraulic joints that hissed and steamed. It carried her for what felt like hours before finding a cave system, a natural shelter formed by volcanic activity centuries ago. There, it finally set her down with surprising gentleness, then positioned itself at the cave entrance like a sentinel. The human tried to speak, her voice cracking with fear and pain from her injured ankle. But the beast only rumbled a sound that vibrated through her chest and disappeared into the darkness outside. It returned with something dead, a local cave-dwelling creature that looked like a cross between a lizard and a mollusk. The beast tore it apart and offered her the cleanest pieces, pushing them toward her with one clawed finger. She gagged but understood the gesture. It was trying to help her survive. As she picked at the alien meat, unable to bring herself to eat it, the beast settled against the opposite wall and watched her. In the dim phosphorescent light from the cave's fungi, she studied it properly for the first time. Beneath the armor plating and weapons-grade enhancements, she could see scars, surgical scars, burn marks, evidence of prolonged torture disguised as experimentation. And in its eyes, something that looked like memory struggling to surface. The creature made a sound, almost gentle, and tapped its chest, then pointed at her. Again and again, the same gesture. She realized with a cold shock it was trying to communicate. Somewhere in that engineered nightmare, someone had taught it to recognize patterns, maybe even basic sign language. And more than that, it had memories that made it see her not as prey, but as something to be protected. The Karnathi kill squad arrived on the second day, their plasma drones sweeping the canyon system with thermal scanners. The beast sensed them before she heard the whine of their engines, and it moved to block the cave entrance again, its body tensing for combat. She grabbed its arm, or tried to, her hands barely spanning the circumference of its forearm, shook her head desperately. "Don't," she whispered, knowing it couldn't understand her words but hoping it would read her intent. "They'll kill you." The beast looked down at her, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding. Then it stepped outside anyway, because the drones had already locked onto their heat signatures. The battle was surgical and brutal. The beast didn't charge blindly, but used the terrain, ducking behind rock formations and timing its attacks to catch drones between recharge cycles. It ripped one from the air and hurled it into another, creating a cascade of explosions that echoed through the canyon. But there were too many, and eventually, plasma fire found its mark, burning through the creature's left leg. It collapsed, but kept fighting, dragging itself forward to maintain position between the drones and the cave where she huddled. She couldn't watch it die protecting her. The human crawled to where her diplomatic communication device had survived the escape, buried in her jacket pocket, and activated its emergency beacon. The signal would reach the Earth delegation ship in orbit if it was still there, if the Karnathi hadn't destroyed it, if she wasn't already written off as acceptable casualties in interstellar politics. The device crackled to life with blessed static, and she spoke rapidly into it, her voice hoarse with smoke and fear, explaining her situation while plasma bolts carved molten scars into the canyon walls above her head. The response came 10 minutes later. "Hold position. Do not engage. We are entering Karnathi space against their direct orders. Stay alive." The transmission cut off, but it was enough. She crawled to the cave entrance, where the beast had finally driven off the remaining drones and now lay bleeding. Its breathing labored. She pressed her hands against its wounds uselessly, her palms coming away black with synthetic blood, and the creature's eyes focused on her with something that might have been gratitude, or simply recognition that it had succeeded in its self-appointed task. The standoff lasted 3 days. Earth's diplomatic vessel, the Ambassador's Reach, hung in orbit above the facility, while Karnathi cruisers surrounded it in a tense blockade. On the planet's surface, Karnathi ground forces established a perimeter around the canyon, but didn't advance not after Earth's delegation had made it clear that any harm to their citizen would be considered an act of war. The human stayed with the beast in the cave, using her jacket to bandage its wounds as best she could, rationing the water from her emergency kit between them, and the beast, in turn, began to teach her its makeshift sign language crude gestures that conveyed hunger, danger, safety, together. It was on the 3rd day that the creature showed her something unexpected. It drew in the dirt floor with one claw, creating simple images, a small figure childlike, a hand extended, the beast tapping its own chest, then the small figure. She understood then, somehow, that this creature had been imprinted with the memory of kindness, perhaps the last remnant of whoever it had been before the Karnathi transformed it into a weapon. That memory had been buried deep, but her presence had awakened it, had given the beast something it recognized as worth protecting at any cost. The Karnathi made their final move when negotiations collapsed. They sent their other experiment subject, K7 Psi, a psychic hunter bred to track and eliminate threats through mental assault. The human felt it before she saw it, a pressure building behind her eyes like an approaching storm, and the beast beside her tensed, sensing the same predatory presence. The hunter entered the canyon silently, its form more liquid than solid, shifting through shadows with unnatural grace. It attacked not with claws but with projected terror, filling the human's mind with visions of death and dissolution until she collapsed screaming. The beast dragged itself upright on damaged legs and charged, meeting the hunter with pure physical force that disrupted its psychic focus. The battle that followed was savage and desperate. 2 weapons of war tearing into each other while the human curled in a ball, her nose bleeding from psychic backlash. The beast was already wounded, already weakening from days without proper sustenance, but it fought with something beyond programmed combat protocols. It fought with purpose. When the hunter finally managed to wrap itself around the beast's torso, beginning to crush and dissolve simultaneously, the creature did something no one expected. It triggered a controlled overload of its own mechanical systems, the resulting electromagnetic pulse burning out the hunter's neural pathways, at the cost of destroying much of its own internal augmentation. The Earth rescue pod came down like a meteor, reverse thrusters screaming as it touched down at the canyon rim. Marines in powered armor poured out, establishing a defensive perimeter, while medics rushed toward the cave with stretchers and emergency equipment. They found the human conscious but battered, cradling the beast's massive head in her lap as it struggled to breathe through damaged lungs. "No," she said when they tried to separate them. "It comes with me. It doesn't get left behind." The lead Marine looked at the dying creature, at the carnage of 2 experimental weapons scattered around the cave entrance, and made a decision that would later be analyzed in military academies. He called for the heavy-lift cargo pod. They loaded the beast onto reinforced supports, the human refusing to leave its side, and extracted both under the coverage of Earth's orbital weapons that had finally moved into firing position. The Karnathi protested through every diplomatic channel available, demanding the return of their property, threatening sanctions and military response. Earth's answer was delivered by their chief negotiator in a live broadcast that reached every settled system. This being chose protection over programming, compassion over conditioning. "We recognize sentient will when we see it. Subject K9 Omega is granted political asylum under Earth's protection." The negotiations that followed were tense and technical, full of legal arguments about property rights versus sapient autonomy. But the human at the center of it all simply refused to engage with the philosophy. She stood in the medical bay of the ambassador's reach, where Earth's doctors worked desperately to stabilize the beast, replacing damaged organs with compatible alternatives, using cutting-edge regenerative treatments that would take months to complete. When the creature finally regained consciousness, its first action was to search for her, its remaining organic eye tracking the room until it found her standing at the bedside. She placed her hand on its massive arm, and it settled, the tension leaving its frame. The Karnathi eventually backed down when it became clear that Earth would not yield on this point, that they valued the principle of protecting those who sought their protection more than they feared economic repercussions. The beast was declared a ward of Earth, legally recognized as a sentient refugee, and granted the right to choose its own path. It chose to stay with the human who had refused to abandon it. 3 months later, at Earth's Interstellar Relations Academy, students and faculty grew accustomed to an unusual sight: a young woman walking across campus, attending lectures on xenodiplomacy and cultural integration, always accompanied by a towering figure of muscle and metal that moved with quiet purpose. The beast, though the human called it something else in private, a name she never shared publicly, no longer looked like a weapon. The doctors had removed the most aggressive augmentations, replaced military-grade plating with medical prosthetics, but they couldn't erase what it was or where it came from. Some students were frightened, others were curious, most simply accepted that this was the being who had chosen to protect rather than destroy, and that meant something in a galaxy where such choices were rare. In seminars, the human would speak about her experience, about survival and unlikely alliances, about how intelligence manifests in forms we might not recognize. And beside her chair, the beast would sit in patient vigil, no longer a subject or experiment, but something the universe had rarely seen, a weapon who had broken its own programming and, in doing so, discovered something more valuable than its intended purpose. It had discovered loyalty freely given, protection without coercion, and a human who had looked at a monster and seen someone worth saving. In a universe built on calculation and self-interest, that was perhaps the most revolutionary thing of all.